Lord Voldemort has just cast the killing curse. The boy who lived lies motionless in the dirt, surrounded by the crushing silence of the Death Eaters and the ancient, brooding trees. But Voldemort, knocked momentarily unconscious by the sheer force of the magical collision and the destruction of the Horcrux within the boy, does not approach the body himself. Instead, he demands that someone verify the kill. He sends Narcissa Malfoy. Picture the scene not as a triumph of evil, but as a moment of agonizing, suspended reality. Describe the moment Narcissa leans over the dead Harry Potter. She does not do so as a loyal servant of the Dark Lord, nor as a zealot desperate to confirm her master's triumph. Her long, pale blonde hair falls like a physical curtain, a barrier shielding her face and her thoughts from the monstrous, slit-pupilled eyes of the most dangerous wizard in a century. She places her delicate hand against the chest of her family's greatest enemy, the boy who thwarted her husband and humiliated her son. Beneath her trembling fingertips, she feels the impossible, the steady, rhythmic thrum of a beating heart. Harry Potter is alive. At this exact juncture, the entire ideological architecture of the Second Wizarding War rests squarely in the hands of a woman who never took the dark mark. Narcissa Malfoy possesses the absolute power to hand Voldemort the world. All she has to do is stand up and tell the truth, but she does not look at the boy as a political obstacle, a symbol of resistance, or a champion of the light. She looks at him as a piece of currency. She leans in closer, dropping her voice to a whisper barely louder than the rustling leaves, and conducts a desperate, primal transaction. "Is Draco alive? Is he in the castle?" she breathes, her voice stripped of its aristocratic haughtiness, reduced to the raw, bleeding edge of maternal panic. Harry Potter nods affirmatively, a microscopic movement that seals the fate of the wizarding world. Narcissa absorbs this information. The transaction is complete. She stands up, turns her back on the boy, looks directly into the snake-like face of the greatest Legilimens of the modern age, and lies. "He is dead," she declares, her voice echoing into the silent canopy. This single declaration is not merely an act of deception. It is the ultimate, undeniable proof that Voldemort's ideology was fundamentally flawed and destined to collapse. It failed because the Dark Lord's grand design of pureblood supremacy, driven by terror and absolute subjugation, could never account for the ancient, primal power of family preservation. Narcissa Malfoy, the seemingly perfect pureblood aristocrat, the haughty mistress of the Manor, dismantles a fascist empire not with a wand, but with a mother's quiet, devastating treason. Here is how we got there. To understand the magnitude of Narcissa's treason, we must trace the Malfoy family's psychological journey from the polished, untouchable arrogance of their early years to the desperate, shattered figures they eventually become. The story of their ideological collapse requires an examination of their historical foundation, for the Malfoys have never been true zealots. They have always been survivalists draped in silk. The Malfoy family name has long been synonymous with power, immense wealth, and an almost serpentine adaptability. The etymology of their surname, derived from the Old French malfoi or Malfoy, literally translates to bad faith or unfaithful. This linguistic marker is the defining characteristic of their lineage. The family traces its roots back to Armand Malfoy, an opportunistic wizard who arrived in Britain alongside William the Conqueror during the Norman invasion of 1066. Armand rendered unknown, shady, and almost certainly magical services to the Muggle king in exchange for a prime estate in Wiltshire, land seized from local owners, which would eventually become the sprawling grounds of Malfoy Manor. For centuries, the Malfoys were pragmatists first and purists second. They mingled heavily with highborn Muggles, expanding their wealth and lands through Muggle currency and art. There is even historical evidence suggesting that the first Lucius Malfoy was an unsuccessful suitor for the hand of Queen Elizabeth I, and some wizarding historians believe her famous refusal to marry was the result of a jinx cast by the thwarted Malfoy. It was only after the imposition of the Statute of Secrecy in 1692 that the Malfoys performed an abrupt, calculated ideological pivot. Realizing that fraternizing with Muggles would now result in political ostracization, they cut all ties with the non-magical world and adopted a fervent, vocal stance on pureblood superiority to maintain their influence within the newly formed Ministry of Magic. This historical context establishes a vital psychological baseline. The Malfoys do not serve ideologies. Ideologies serve the Malfoys. Unlike fanatical families such as the Gaunts or the Lestranges, who practice dangerous inbreeding to maintain blood purity to the point of enfeeblement and instability, the Malfoys eschewed this practice. They were perfectly willing to accept half-bloods onto their family tree to preserve their genetic health, demonstrating that their commitment to blood purity was always secondary to the preservation and prosperity of their own lineage. By the time the events of the modern era unfold, Lucius Malfoy operates as the untouchable sovereign of wizarding aristocracy. He is the ultimate power behind the throne, financing political campaigns, whispering in the ear of the Minister for Magic, Cornelius Fudge, and ensuring his family remains at the absolute apex of society. Lucius embodies the polished arrogance of a man who believes his blood, combined with his bank vault, makes him a god. We see him attempt to exert this cultural influence openly in his campaign to ban the classic wizarding fairy tale from the Hogwarts library, simply because the story, The Fountain of Fair Fortune, dared to depict a positive marriage between a witch and a muggle. In his letters to the Hogwarts Board of Governors, Lucius demanded the removal of any work that depicted interbreeding, claiming he did not wish his son to be influenced into sullying the purity of his bloodline. Albus Dumbledore's scathing refusal of Lucius's demand perfectly summarizes the family's manufactured superiority. So-called pure-blood families maintain their alleged purity by disowning, banishing, or lying about muggles or muggleborns on their family trees. They then attempt to foist their hypocrisy upon the rest of us. Dumbledore further noted that there is not a single witch or wizard in existence whose blood has not mingled with muggles, exposing the Malfoy platform as a hollow political construct. Draco Malfoy is raised in this suffocating atmosphere of exceptionalism, sequestered within the magnificent mansion in Wiltshire. From the moment he could speak, he was taught that he was triply special, firstly as a wizard, secondly as a pureblood, and thirdly as a member of the Malfoy family. When Draco first encounters Harry Potter in Madame Malkin's robes for all occasions, and later on the Hogwarts Express, he genuinely believes he is offering a superior alliance, warning Harry against making friends with the wrong sort. The rejection of this handshake is the first crack in the glass of Draco's worldview. The Malfoys begin the saga standing at the zenith of their power, draped in expensive robes, wielding influence like a blunt instrument, utterly convinced that their wealth, their bloodline, and their allegiance to the dark arts render them invincible. But this polished exterior was fundamentally hollow, masking a fragile core that was wholly unprepared for the brutal, uncompromising realities of true fanaticism. To comprehend the nature of Narcissa Malfoy's psychology and the ultimate trajectory of her betrayal, an exhaustive analysis of her origin is required. Narcissa was born into the noble and most ancient House of Black, an institution built on a foundation of absolute fanaticism. She is the youngest daughter of Cygnus Black III and Druella Black, née Rosier. The Rosier family, like the Blacks, strongly believed in blood purity, creating an environment where the daughters were steeped in prejudice from birth. The Black family tree is a literal and metaphorical tapestry that is frequently burned and pruned to eliminate any branch that strays from their maniacal devotion to pure-blood supremacy. Within the toxic pressure cooker environment of the Black household, Cygnus and Druella's parenting yielded three distinct, highly symbolic outcomes in their daughters. One rebelled, one obeyed, and one found the middle path. Andromeda Black was the rebel. Disgusted by the cruelty and bigotry of her family, she chose love over duty, marrying the muggle-born wizard Ted Tonks. For this act of ideological treason, she was brutally disowned, her face blasted off the family tapestry, and she was shunned by her parents and sisters. She completely rejected pureblood supremacy, prioritizing her moral autonomy. Though it cost her her aristocratic status, she achieved spiritual freedom by walking away from her inheritance and burning the bridge to her past. Bellatrix Lestrange was the zealot. She absorbed her parents' pureblood mania with a breathtaking and terrifying completeness. Bellatrix dove headfirst into the abyss of the dark arts, marrying Rodolphus Lestrange not for love, but to further blood purity. She found her true psychotic devotion in Lord Voldemort, dedicating her life to his service with a cruel delight. Her core allegiance belonged entirely to the Dark Lord, a devotion that left absolutely no room for familial loyalty, mercy, or self-preservation. ultimately leading to the complete loss of her humanity, her imprisonment in Azkaban, and her death in battle. And then there was Narcissa. She was the steady sister, the one who neither openly rebelled nor fully surrendered her soul to the dark abyss. The etymology of her name is highly revealing and operates as a literary key to her character. While her parents broke the traditional black family custom of naming children after stars and constellations to name her Narcissa, the name itself carries profound weight. Derived from the Greek myth of Narcissus, it implies vanity, elitism, and self-absorption. More importantly, the name of the associated flower, the daffodil, is derived from the Greek word narcoa, meaning to numb, referring to its narcotic properties. Narcissa acted as the shield of her family. She practiced pragmatic pureblood preservation, maintaining this numb, iced-over exterior, while her core allegiance remained fiercely tied to her family, Draco and Lucius. Harry Potter frequently observed that she possessed a haughty beauty, though she often wore an expression that suggested she was sniffing dung whenever forced to interact with those she deemed her inferiors. She played the role of the perfect pureblood princess flawlessly, making a highly respectable marriage and maintaining the pristine image of the aristocratic wife. She embraced the ideology of her family because it benefited her lifestyle and solidified her status. She was not a secret hero. She was highly prejudiced, cold, and not afraid to be cruel. When Harry, Ron, and Hermione encountered her in Madame Malkin's in their 6th year, Narcissa openly called them scum and venomously threatened Harry that he would soon be reunited with dear Sirius, mocking the tragic death of her own cousin. Yet, the true myth of Narcissa's silver exterior lay in what she refused to do. While her husband, her brother-in-law, and her fanatical sister all knelt before Voldemort and allowed him to brand their flesh with the dark mark, Narcissa never took the mark. This distinction is monumental. Narcissa's allegiance was strictly lateral, not vertical. She was an accessory to Voldemort's inner circle by default, through her marriage to a Death Eater and her blood relation to Bellatrix, but she never formally submitted her soul to Voldemort's direct ownership. By keeping her left forearm unblemished, Narcissa maintained a microscopic but profound sliver of autonomy. This allowed her to operate in a psychological shadow that the branded Death Eaters could not access. Voldemort believed her loyalty was guaranteed by her marriage to Lucius, her hatred of Muggles, and the influence of Bellatrix, fundamentally failing to understand that Narcissa's true religion was not pure-blood supremacy, but the House of Malfoy. Her lack of a dark mark was the physical manifestation of her emotional independence. She was loyal to the aesthetics of supremacy, but not to its architect. The turning point for the Malfoy family, the precise moment their polished arrogance shattered into desperate, unadulterated terror, occurred in the belly of the Ministry of Magic at the end of the Second Wizarding War's quiet phase. Following the catastrophic failure to secure the prophecy at the Department of Mysteries, Lucius Malfoy is apprehended, exposed as a Death Eater, and locked away in Azkaban. In an instant, the Malfoy patriarch goes from being the untouchable puppet master of the Ministry to a disgraced prisoner. With Lucius incarcerated and the Malfoy name fallen from grace, Voldemort turns his cold, reptilian wrath upon the family. He establishes his headquarters at Malfoy Manor, effectively transforming the ancestral home from a palace of wealth into an occupied fortress of terror. The atmosphere of the manor shifts drastically. The opulent sitting rooms, once used to host elegant dinners and plot political maneuvers, become torture chambers and staging grounds for monsters. The Hogwarts Muggle Studies professor, Charity Burbage, is suspended over their drawing room table, murdered before their eyes, and fed to Voldemort's snake, Nagini. This brutal occupation precipitates a violent psychological shift within the family. They are no longer the elite. They have become Voldemort's doormats. The weight of this new, terrifying reality crushes Draco. In an act of pure, vindictive punishment directed at the imprisoned Lucius, Voldemort assigns the 16-year-old Draco an impossible task, the assassination of Albus Dumbledore. Voldemort frames this as a great honor, but it is nothing less than a death sentence. Narcissa recognizes this immediately. She possesses the political acumen to see past Voldemort's rhetoric. She knows that Voldemort fully expects her son to fail, intending for Draco to be killed in the attempt as a brutal, agonizing reprisal for Lucius's incompetence. We see the rot taking hold of Draco's mind throughout his 6th year. The boy who once strutted through the corridors of Hogwarts bragging about his father's influence is now reduced to a pale, sickly phantom. He suffers from profound insomnia, his trademark arrogance entirely evaporated, replaced by a suffocating, paralyzing fear. The psychological burden of the task shatters him. Harry Potter discovers Draco weeping uncontrollably in Moaning Myrtle's bathroom, crumbling under the realization that he is not a killer. When the moment comes to cast the fatal curse atop the astronomy tower, Draco lowers his wand. His carefully constructed facade of nonchalance gives way to a boy who is fundamentally afraid. When Lucius is eventually freed from Azkaban, he returns to his home a broken man. He has been stripped of his dignity, his political sway, and, most devastatingly in the wizarding world, his wand. When Voldemort demands a wand to circumvent the twin cores of Harry's wand, he forces Lucius to surrender his own. Lucius hesitates, looking to Narcissa for silent guidance before handing it over. It is in this profound moment of emasculation that the hierarchy of the Malfoy family fundamentally realigns. Lucius is paralyzed. Draco is terrified. Narcissa, the steady sister, steps forward to take the reins. The Malfoys' motivation has officially mutated. They are no longer fighting for the triumph of pureblood supremacy or the glory of the Dark Lord. They are fighting for mere survival. The ideology that had elevated them to the status of royalty has now placed a madman at the head of their dining table and a target on their only son's back. Narcissa realizes with chilling clarity that Voldemort is not the savior of their kind. He is the destroyer of her family. Narcissa's transition from a passive, privileged pureblood wife to an active, desperate combatant against Voldemort's design begins in the grim, rain-slicked streets of Spinner's End. Defying the Dark Lord's explicit orders to remain silent regarding Draco's mission, Narcissa seeks out Severus Snape. She is pursued by a frantic Bellatrix, who desperately tries to dissuade her sister, arguing that Snape is untrustworthy and that defying the Dark Lord's instructions is tantamount to treason. This scene is a masterclass in contrasting psychologies and the breaking point of fanaticism. Bellatrix is entirely indoctrinated, arguing that to sacrifice one's children for the Dark Lord is the highest privilege imaginable. Narcissa, however, completely drops her Narcoa mask. The Ice Queen shatters. Driven by an uncharacteristic display of unfettered emotion, she throws herself at Snape, seizing the front of his robes. Her tears fall openly onto his chest as she gasps out her pleas for his intervention. He does not mean him to succeed. He wants him to be killed, trying. Narcissa chokes out, articulating the truth that Bellatrix refuses to see. To secure her son's safety, Narcissa initiates the unbreakable vow, a binding magical contract compelling Snape to protect Draco and, if Draco fails, to complete the assassination of Dumbledore himself. Bellatrix serves as the bonder for this act, her wand binding their hands with tendrils of brilliant fire. While Bellatrix views the vow as a test of Snape's loyalty to the cause, it is, in reality, a monumental act of treason orchestrated by Narcissa. By forcing Snape into the unbreakable vow, Narcissa is actively subverting Voldemort's punitive design. Voldemort ordered Draco to commit the murder as a punishment designed to torture the Malfoys. Narcissa engineers a magical loophole to spare her son's soul and ensure his survival. It is her first true act of war against the Dark Lord. She decides definitively that the preservation of Draco's life is worth risking the wrath of the most powerful dark wizard in history. Her primal loyalty to her son eclipses her fear of her master and her devotion to the pureblood cause. To fully appreciate the narrative genius of Narcissa's thematic arc, one must look at the brilliant foil woven into the story by J.K. Rowling, the metaphor of the silver hand, contrasting Narcissa with Peter Pettigrew. During the dark, grotesque ritual that restored Voldemort's physical body in the graveyard of Little Hangleton, Peter Pettigrew, Wormtail, severed his own right hand to fulfill the requirement of flesh of the servant. In return for this mutilation, Voldemort rewarded his cowardly servant with a magically constructed, literal silver hand, a gleaming prosthetic of immense strength. It was capable of crushing a solid twig to fine dust and seemingly yielded entirely to Pettigrew's command. However, Voldemort's gifts are never without venom. They are always instruments of control, not mere rewards or tokens of favor. Years later, in the dungeon of Malfoy Manor, Harry Potter confronts Pettigrew, reminding him that he owes Harry a life debt for saving him from Sirius Black and Remus Lupin years prior. For a microscopic fraction of a second, Pettigrew hesitates. He experiences a fleeting, infinitesimal moment of mercy, a sudden, involuntary reluctance to murder the boy whose blood he shares. The Silver Hand detects this treason immediately, and recognizing its master's weakness, operates independently of Pettigrew's will. It turns on him, closing its indestructible silver fingers around his own throat, strangling him to death. Pettigrew is executed by the very instrument he believed gave him power, killed because Voldemort's ideology cannot tolerate pity or hesitation. This literal, magical prosthetic was grafted onto his flesh to replace what was sacrificed, enforcing absolute subjugation and acting as a monitor that punished weakness with immediate, violent strangulation. He met his ultimate fate through unyielding subservience. Narcissa, on the other hand, operates as the metaphorical silver hand of the Malfoy family, the polished, unyielding, aristocratic force that steadies Lucius and guides Draco. But because she never allowed Voldemort to brand her flesh, her hand remains entirely her own. This allows for independent thought and secretive action. When she is presented with her own opportunity to show mercy in the Forbidden Forest, she uses it as a calculated, strategic weapon. She is not choked by a magical failsafe. Where Pettigrew's silver hand killed him for an involuntary twitch of pity, Narcissa's pristine, unmarked hands allow her to execute a transaction of mercy, securing the survival of both Harry Potter and her own son. Pettigrew died because he was a slave to fear. Narcissa lived because she was a slave only to love. Before the climax in the forest, the total degradation of the Malfoys' ideological loyalty is cemented during the skirmish at Malfoy Manor. When Harry, Ron, and Hermione are captured by snatchers led by a savage tracker and dragged to the manor, Hermione fires a stinging jinx into Harry's face, swelling his features to render him unrecognizable. The snatchers present the prisoners. This is a golden opportunity for the family to restore their status. Lucius is practically vibrating with desperate excitement, believing that by handing Harry over, they will be forgiven and restored to favor. He pushes his son forward to identify him, but Draco, reflecting the deep psychological damage inflicted upon him over the past year, cannot do it. When asked to identify his bitter rival, Draco hesitates. He cannot bring himself to look at Harry properly, offering only weak, non-committal answers. He refuses to confirm Harry's identity, effectively saving Harry from certain death in that moment. Draco's moral compass, however buried under years of prejudice, prevents him from actively becoming an accomplice to murder. Simultaneously, the power dynamic in the house completely ruptures. A fanatic female follower enters and immediately usurps Lucius's authority, panicking when the sword of Gryffindor is spotted among the prisoner's possessions and starting a vicious argument. Lucius tries to pretend he is still the master of his own home, but the rival viciously reminds him that he has lost his authority, his favor, and his wand. Narcissa watches as her sister threatens to murder her husband and torture Hermione Granger.